I'm delighted once again to be speaking with Ryan McBeth, influential YouTuber, author, triathlete, Army veteran, and programmer. Ryan makes educational and OSINT videos that look at the war in Ukraine from a military perspective. And today we're going to be talking about the evolution of not just military techniques and technologies, but also the training that is required to go along with those, and ask the question about whether Western armies are actually able to keep up with the evolution that's taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Thank you to all the subscribers who've supported the channel, bought me a coffee, done Patreon, all that kind of stuff. Also supported the documentary film project we're doing, or helped to buy the 4x4 vehicles that we purchased in December. And now we've got another campaign going on that as well to get these essential vehicles over to Ukraine so they can be refitted and taken to the front. So thank you to everyone who's supported us on that one. All the relevant links will be in the description of the video. Ryan, let's get into it. I'm absolutely delighted you accepted my invitation to come back on. These are always thrilling conversations, and I know the audience gets tremendous value from them.
Oh, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
I've been looking at your videos, and I think there's a fantastic sort of title you put, but also your video was far more nuanced in terms of the discussion. But it was titled "The Betrayal of Ukraine." Is it betrayal, or is the new administration in the US just indifferent to the fate of Ukraine? Or is it worse than
Well,
that? Is Ukraine an
yeah.
irritation, a kind of obstruction to the kind of deals that it wants to land with Russia?
So betrayal always gets more clicks than irritation, right?
Yes.
I mean that's when you're kind of doing what I do, you kind of have to worry about that. But one of the things that I realized talking with people in the administration was that Ukraine, you can consider it an annoyance at this point because the United States needs to pivot to the Pacific. And really, the only way that we can do that is if Europe starts taking care of itself and allows us to move some of our units out of Europe and into the Pacific. I'm thinking specifically of the 173rd. I could easily see that 173rd Airborne, which is a separate brigade in Italy. Um, Units like armor units that won't be too useful in the Pacific, but I could easily see something like the 173rd Brigade being pulled out of Italy and sent to, let's say, the Philippines, something like that, just to make it easier for the United States to fight China when that time comes. So, as horrible as it is to say, I believe the strategy here is to just turn the war off as fast as possible. And it doesn't matter if Russia wins or Ukraine wins. It's winning is irrelevant. And I've often said there is no win, right? Like neither side is going to win. Um, Even if this war ends tomorrow with Ukraine in possession of all the territory it had before, it's going to take years of demining. People are going to need to be in psychological counseling for years to come. You have thousands of amputees, and there is no win, right? No side is going to win. Ukraine is not going to drive all the way to Moscow, and at this point, we've kind of realized Russia can't drive all the way to Kyiv, right? So there is no win. But if the war gets turned off and it doesn't matter where the front lines are, then Europe can try to stabilize and build up their forces. And then the United States can shift some of their forces to the Pacific where they're needed. Now, this might not be the best plan, but it is a plan. And I think that's kind of the route that the U.S. is going when it comes to trying to negotiate to end the war.
And of course, Biden had a different approach. I mean, Biden was minded to, send Ukraine, certain equipment and what it needs, in essence, to keep the war going to some extent. But actually, this pivot to China is something that actually the Biden administration had in common. They were also already shifting their focus. This isn't just a sort of Trump obsession, is it? This is quite a long-term view within the strategic planning in military circles in the US.
Oh, I can tell you, what's interesting about President Biden is that, it would kind of be like he would say, okay, what does Ukraine need? Okay, they need that. Okay, give them half of that. Right? Like there was that sense of urgency to get Ukraine weapon systems, but the sense of urgency wasn't necessarily there the whole time. And the other issue was that the president was very reluctant to antagonize Russia, which is, look, we have hundreds of hundreds or not. We have F-16s in the boneyard sitting in Arizona. And these F-16s are just sitting there and they're waiting to be used, right? In case there's a really big war, or we need parts. We could have easily started the process of getting Ukrainians trained up on the F-16 3 years ago. And instead we waited, and then the Netherlands said they would send some, and we waited for other countries to take action. We could have taken action ourselves. And
It's
you
similar
are
in the volume
right.
of tanks, isn't it? I mean, the volume on tanks as well is when you look at it is pretty minute when you look at the scale of the front line.
Yeah, I mean, we sent Ukraine 24 M1 Abrams, and I believe so far 4 or 6 of them have been destroyed or captured by Russia. And yeah, they will get captured, they will get destroyed. That's just what happens, right? During war. Um, but you are right in the sense that under President Biden, we kind of realized, all right, we need to pivot to LSCO. We need to pivot to large scale combat operations against China because President Xi Jinping has said you will, the army must be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Whether they will or not, it's a different story. We are prepared for China to invade Taiwan by 2027. Most likely, it'll probably be something like 2028 because that's when there's a presidential election. But you are right that President Biden started that pivot over to LSCO, large scale combat operations, in his term. But now it's a couple years closer, right? We're 4 years closer than we were before. And we need to start worrying about what China is going to do in the next couple of years.
And of course, the Chinese economy has some serious issues. And to an extent, Putin began his war. In fact, all of Putin's wars with his FSB support have been to shore up his democratic, stability. Well, I say non-democratic stability, as it were. Every time they start a war, it tends to be before an election. It tends to be in order to sort of manipulate the political system. I don't know if China runs on the same kind of logic, and certainly it hasn't started the number of wars that Putin has. But if Xi Jinping's regime starts to look a little bit shaky, there's nothing like a sort of surge of nationalist sentiment to maybe, in their thinking, unite people behind the government.
You're absolutely correct. And look, China is definitely playing the long game in the sense that this is China has been around for 5,000 years, right? So they have the time to wait and play the long game when it comes to invasion. They've actually already started building the landing barges. They're called jack barges. I don't know if you've ever seen if you ever look at an oil platform. You can float these oil platforms out to some place and you kind of drop the legs and they rise up and they stand on those legs as they drill for oil. Well, China has just started creating these jack barges, which are essentially large barges with landing legs. And if you look at Taiwan, there's essentially only 3 or so beaches on the east side of Taiwan that can actually support an amphibious landing. The rest is just it's this rocky shoreline with a ring road that surrounds the country. And so the whole plan is bring the jack barge up, drop the legs. There's a ramp that pops off, and then the back of the ship opens up, and ferries can come by and deliver tanks. So they've already started building these things, and that should be a concern. And that's the that's the sign, right? That's the sign that China is intending to invade. They've already started building these ships. You're not going to build these ships unless you have an intention of invading.
Now I'm going to say
So,
something a little
mhm,
bit maybe annoying or upsetting, especially if
sure.
you're Taiwanese. But it seems that, China is overtly talking about Taiwan. It's not yet talking about a sort of global imperialism. I mean, maybe one could argue that in economic terms, it's already practicing a kind of global imperialism, albeit not the sort of the kind that Russia does, which is, violating sovereign borders. But they, of course, they have penetrated many countries with their influence and of course their spy networks, including many European countries, US and other places, with huge investments. It seems to me, though, Russia is far more overtly an imperial threat. So is this strategy sort of saying, okay, this island of Taiwan, that's strategically important? Or does it go further than that? Because it would seem that Russia is threatening the entire continent of Europe. And of
Mhm.
course, the US economy is very intimately tied to imports, exports from Europe. And that's, hence the investment in alliances over the last sort of 80 years. It's an intrinsic part. If Europe was to fall to Russia in a worst case scenario, the consequences for the US would be tremendously damaging, maybe far more important than, say, Taiwan falling to China.
Well, I would say it would probably be about equal. I mean, if you look, the device that you're broadcasting this on has a chip that most likely came from China or from Taiwan, right? Just about any semiconductor that is used in a computer was manufactured in Taiwan, right? Losing that would be very bad, any kind of consumer products. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is um, we're you can kind of consider this to be a preview, the current tariff war that's going on, for what it might look like if China invades Taiwan and they stop shipping stuff to the US. Because once that happens, we're not going to get our cheap alarm clocks anymore. We're not going to get our $400 TVs anymore. And we're going to have to use this as some sort of practice, right? Where are the kinks in our supply chain that we have to worry about once war comes? Because we're not going to have those cheap Chinese goods anymore. We need to figure out where we can get those from, or even where we can get rare earths. I believe there was someone had told me that China has threatened to cut off access to all of the rare earths that they sell us if these trade deals aren't negotiated quickly. And that's going to be a problem. So we have to figure out where we can get these rare earths from if China is out of the loop or out of that supply chain. So in
Suddenly
some ways,
Ukraine becomes kind of more interesting there. It's got apparently quite a substantial supply of these things.
Ukraine is one of the things about Ukraine, and I covered this in this video I did, or this I did an intelligence briefing in Ohio a couple of days ago. And one of the things Ukraine has accomplished is they've started to build motors for their drones. Now they're still getting the majority of their motors from China, but it's pretty darned impressive when a country like Ukraine has started to build its own motors. There's very, very few motor suppliers in the world. These are the electric motors that make the blades on the drone spin. And I can tell you that in the US, we can press or we can fab our carbon fiber. We can do some of the chips. We can do some of the flight controllers. Motors, just we can fab some motors here, but I could easily see Ukraine becoming a supply of motors for the United States at some point. We just have to maintain good relationships with Ukraine, which That remains to be seen what our relationships are going to be like in the future.
Absolutely, and that also brings on to drones as well, because from conversations I've been having, I know you really, watch this space intently. It does seem that Ukrainians are intent on swapping out, the components of these drones for European, US made parts, not Chinese parts. And they're doing it with some degree of success, and they're actually starting to 3D print a lot of components sort of locally and even in the field as well, which is interesting. Have you sort of been sort of following this, let's say, this manufacturing warfare that's going on?
I have to some extent. I mean, I do have a stock portfolio for my retirement, and it's been an interesting ride. I've lost about 26% over the past couple of weeks. That's something nobody ever likes to see, right? Um, and I can tell you that there is a significant amount of pain involved in that. But the other thing is that I can also kind of see where it's going, because I think the idea here is, well, if we kind of force ourselves cold turkey off of foreign products, then maybe we'll start reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. The problem with that is we you can't just turn a key and open a factory again, right? I've often said, like, hey, we sold our soul for $10 alarm clocks. And when you kind of think about it, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when the United States was starting to pivot a lot of electronics production to China, you would get fired if you were a CEO of a company and you were like, "Hey, we should manufacture in the U.S." The board would fire you. It made sense to manufacture in China because it could be done a lot cheaper there. Whereas if you stayed in America, you're dealing with unions, you're dealing with environmental laws, you're dealing with lots of regulations, and it just made sense to manufacture in China. And I think it was COVID that was the first look at what we've done to our manufacturing in the U.S. Because I remember when when I when the mask crisis was going on, we were being told, do not buy N95 masks because they're needed for hospitals. Found out there was only one N95 mask supplier, one manufacturer in the U.S. It was 3M. 3M manufactured N95 masks in the U.S., but the rest were manufactured in China. I thought, we only have one factory? What the heck? How is that possible? But it's possible because it was just cheaper to manufacture in China. I recently wrote a book, The Wind Machine. You can find this on Amazon and an Audible if you're a Marine. And in The Wind Machine, it deals with a war with China that was predicted by a hedge fund manager. And one of the things that they realized during the war was that most ibuprofen was manufactured in China. There's only one factory, is BASF factory in Texas, that could make ibuprofen, and most of that went to the military and to hospitals. So if there's a war with China, we're not going to have ibuprofen in the United States. I don't know what they call ibuprofen in jolly old England.
That same
I know
same
you call
thing.
Tylenol acetaminophen, so Motrin. I don't know what you call ibuprofen,
Same,
but
same thing. Yeah, well,
same
it's an
thing. All right.
ingredient. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that would be problematic. I mean,
Hmm.
I take that stuff on a regular basis, getting headaches from let's say all the flood of news that we're watching. Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
Yeah.
Drones, though, I mean, this is
Yeah.
fascinating because if you look at the way Ukraine has been able to force the Black Sea Fleet out where it barely has, any sort of traditional marine capability. A lot of that was seized when Crimea was taken, but
Yeah.
it has used this innovative drone techniques as well as other expertise to basically sink a bunch of Russia's ships and force the others out and re-establish the trade volumes it had before. Incredibly impressive. Now we'll come to the rather extraordinary deal that's let these killing machines back into the Black Sea. We'll come to that in a minute. But are there any lessons there for this sort of highly innovative marine drone warfare that could perhaps be learnt and applied to the Taiwan case?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the United States has been experimenting with drone ships. And one of the things we've done is we've containerized the SM-6 and the Tomahawk missile. So essentially, we put these things in shipping containers and we can put them on a truck. Theoretically, we can put them on like a littoral combat ship. And now this thing has four Tomahawks or four SM-6s, which are the anti-aircraft missiles. And that gives a little more punch. Or we can put it on a drone ship. So if you need some extra firepower, you'd be able to throw some of these things on a drone ship, or maybe even a supply ship or a cargo ship, and you can link that up with the destroyers. And when the destroyer needs to fire a missile, it can fire a missile from one of these container ships instead of using the vertical launch systems from their own ship. And we need to swap the container out, just take it off the deck, plop a new one down. Right? You don't have to necessarily pull into port and get the cranes out and load those vertical launch tubes. That's actually a huge issue. What do you call it? The USS Carney. About a year ago, the USS Carney came back from fighting in the Red Sea, where it was essentially shooting down Houthi drones, and essentially it came back Winchester, where it didn't have a single surface-to-air missile left. I'm really proud of those guys. They they did an incredible job fighting. I think they went like 56 and 0. They shot down 56 Iranian drones fired from the Houthis. Um, they did a fantastic job. But that ship, it can't reload at sea. So it has to go back to a port. I think the closest one is Roe to Spain. It has to pull into port, and they have to use a crane to take the previous VLS boxes out and put the new vertical launch boxes in. And that takes time. And with these container ships that were put on drone ships, that really reduces with these containers put on drone ships, it really reduces the amount of time it would take to to reload. So yeah, absolutely. Ukraine has done some incredible things when it comes to advancing the science of using drones against an adversary.
And it's interesting. Well, we'll quickly touch on the Black Sea thing as well, because without getting sort of too political, it seems that this extraordinary deal that's been struck, even though Russia is sort of breaking almost every condition of it, that their sort of killing machines, their fleet, what's left of it, has been allowed back into the Black Sea. I think the intent of the deal was that that would allow them to, resurrect their trade or, do those sort of peaceful activities. Needless to say, they've already used that renewed access to fire missiles from the Black Sea towards the Odessa direction. Um, I don't know what your thoughts are there, because I find this just absolutely extraordinary that this Ukrainian win would be taken and diluted and really no benefit provided back to Ukraine in return.
That is a suboptimal negotiation. Like, I can't say any more than I absolutely agree with you. Look,
Art of the deal, to be
yeah,
slightly
it
ironic there, yeah.
provides another vector for missile launch. And right now Ukraine has to worry about land-based drones taking off from Crimea. It has to worry about drones coming from Donetsk and Luhansk. It has to worry about bombers, fire and cruise missiles from Ingalls Air Base. And just adding those ships back in, it makes it a lot harder to figure out your defense strategy.
Absolutely. Well,
Mm.
let's talk about drones because another interesting comment, and again, I'm by no means any kind of expert on this, that someone was describing that there's a slightly different approach taken by the Russians and Ukrainians to drones. That's not to say that the Russians aren't innovating. Unfortunately, they do seem to be.
Mhm.
But in both armies, you have these sort of pockets of excellence. But the Ukrainian side seems to be developing a whole zoo of drones, becoming very specialized. You've got a drone for this, a drone for that. They've got different sizes, different capabilities, different ranges, and you've got this extraordinary competition and evolution. Whereas it seems the Russians have gone for far fewer drone types, far more, I would say, sort of, unity of design, as it were, but they're going for scale. And of course, they're the ones that innovated the so-called fly-by-wire. And I think the latest distance that someone was telling me, now I'd heard about ones that go sort of 20 kilometers, 40 kilometers, but apparently some drones have now been clocked at 100 kilometers using this sort of fiber optics, which is
I
absolutely mind-blowing.
I haven't heard 100 kilometers. I've heard 50 kilometers. It's certainly possible that they could go 100 kilometers. But I can tell you that the reason this has happened, it comes down to manufacturing. Russia, it took them about a year and a half to figure out how to innovate, and then they started to innovate. And when you kind of think about it, Russia is actually more dangerous now than it was at the start of the war because they have this real world experience of fighting a Lisco conflict. They have this real world experience integrating in with drones. That's an issue. And I can tell you that Ukraine, the reason they're so innovative with their drones is that they have literally thousands of small factories that produce these drones. And a lot of these factories are associated with individual brigades. So a brigade might come up with an idea and they'll tell their drone manufacturers, and their drone manufacturers will build it. They'll send it back to the brigade. The brigade will use it. They'll take video footage of it being used, which they'll put online, which encourages people to donate to the brigade so that the unit making the drones can get more money. And then if there's any changes that need to be made, that brigade can call their manufacturers back and say, hey, can you actually do this? Right? Can you actually create this kind of drone, or can you modify the drone to do something else? And that's pretty darn innovative. Kind of the issue that you run into though is these brigades don't often talk to each other. They don't always talk to each other. So one brigade might have solved a problem, but they don't necessarily know that another brigade in a different sector has solved that problem. So that other brigade is creating a drone that has deficiencies, and they're going to have to figure that out for themselves. But the reason you're seeing all these different kinds of drones in Ukraine is that they have these distributed manufacturing programs where you have these tiny shops, some only 10 people, and these shops are producing drones on demand from the brigade with the criteria from that brigade.
And it also impacts trade, doesn't it? Because if you have more traditional military structures and more centralized training, and you have procurement processes at a sort of governmental level, these things can not only be extraordinarily slow, but also the evolution of the sort of training and techniques by its very nature. I mean, it cannot be updated monthly or even weekly based on new information and new understandings. How can Western militaries reform or keep up with this style of warfare if their procurement processes, their training cycles, their innovation cycles are no way near what is happening on the front lines in Ukraine?
Well, I don't necessarily know if you would have to. Um, So the US, I forget the darn name of the program, but there is a program to do things like 3D print parts on demand, 3D print tools on demand, and even print drones on demand. And that's very useful. But the reason that Ukraine went this route of using drones excessively is that we didn't give them enough artillery. And so, look, when you manufacture a drone and you put an explosive on that drone is only one way. And then you have to manufacture it again, right? After the thing explodes in Russian territory. And it is much more efficient to use that drone's camera to spot for artillery. You need to kill by the bushel, not in onesies and twosies. And so Ukraine defaulted to the strategy of killing in onesies and twosies basically because they had to. They didn't really have a choice. And that's something that I don't know. It's we really failed Ukraine when it came to getting them the artillery ammunition they needed. That's an issue. But they were able to recover from that simply by building these drones and using them against Russian forces the way you would normally use artillery.
I also heard it said, and this is some Ukrainians describing, the challenge of this, that not all the features of a sort of Soviet army, and I mean the negative features, have gone away. So what you essentially have is a large Soviet army fighting a smaller Soviet army, but with pockets of extraordinary excellence, which, as you said earlier, don't necessarily talk to each other in the way that they should do, or share intelligence, or share, knowledge or understanding. Do you think there's some truth to this idea that the Ukrainian army still has, rather destructive characteristics of a Soviet force?
So one of the issues with the Ukrainian army is that sometimes brigades they don't necessarily talk to each other. In some cases, they might actually compete with each other because they are competing for those dollars, right? Or those euros from Europe for people helping fund their drone projects. A lot of people who are above brigade, they grew up in that Soviet style of military. Now, when you're talking battalion and below, and when you're talking volunteers, these people who picked up weapons and joined their local militia, those people tend to think in a more Western mindset. But if you have people who are trained in a Western mindset, like they went over to England and they trained with the British Army for 3 months, and they come back at the company level, at the battalion level, they might certainly be a Western trained force. But if they're being managed by a guy with a Soviet mindset, all that is lost. And one huge issue with Ukraine is that they just can't quite do um, large scale operations above the brigade level. They just don't have the tools, the software, the command and control measures that you would need in order to do these multi-brigade operations. So that's certainly it's you're certainly right that there is that disparity between the lower ranking or the lower structures in battalion level, company level, platoon level, motivated soldiers who were been taught to fight in the Western model, and guys who essentially graduated from Soviet academies.
And despite the learnings, and I think we underestimate Russia at our peril, but despite that, we still see these extraordinary examples of them attacking, in single units in broad daylight. You see their armor advancing across, wide open spaces with a bunch of guys just sort of sitting on top, waiting to get taken out. And then the inevitable happens. The Ukrainians come in, the monitoring drones spot them, and however long it takes, that unit is taken out. Why do they still do what seems to me to be sort of fairly suicidal tactics with the consequent loss of precious equipment as well? And does that mean they're not really likely to make any major headway? Even when the sort of spring summer offensives begin, we're unlikely to see any major advances by Russian forces.
That's a very good question. I wish I could give you a good answer on that. Um, the answer I could probably give is that because so far it's worked, and sending people in these suicide attacks has worked for Russia. They are gaining ground, and they are gaining ground slowly, but they are grinding Ukraine down. And if something is working, why change it, right? Now, I could easily say, well, they should pull people off the line and train them in a different way. But Russia is still, they still have that issue of they don't have the non-commissioned officers which are necessary for moving small units independently. Right? A lot of their stuff is controlled by, they're still controlled by officers. They don't have that professional NCO corps that a lot of Western armies do. And so they just might not have the technical and tactical ability to move units in small groups. So they do attack in these meat wave attacks, just because it is the easiest for them to command and control.
And even, sending single vehicles into almost certain suicide. I mean, that still takes a toll on the Ukrainian side potentially as well. And we've also heard this thing that, Ukraine has suffered tremendously in terms of recruitment challenges. And it's been said that Russia's also, had trouble finding people, but it seems to rustle up, the 20, 30, 35,000 of the figures I've heard per month that it needs to by offering more and more money. And Ukraine certainly had a real challenge with the recruitment. I am hearing some sort of, rumbles at this point that actually that started to ease a little bit, that some of the sort of waves of trained troops are coming through, even though it must be, horrific on the front, and many people, haven't had any time to sort of decompress or time away from the front. But it certainly doesn't look like there's an impending collapse on the Ukrainian side. Despite some alarmist sort of media headlines and the usual sort of fatnik stuff that we see, claiming that Ukraine is over and beaten, it certainly seems it's very far from a collapse of the front line.
Well, a lot of that comes from their drones. I mean, look, I've when I did this drone brief for the U.S. intelligence, I talked with a couple of Ukrainian drone units, and they say they're not necessarily fighting defensively with rifles and machine guns anymore. A lot of it's drones. When the Russians start to approach, they launch the drones. So, from what I understand, 70% of all casualties in Ukraine currently are from drones. It used to be that 70% was from artillery. Now it's 70% drones. And I think when you are sending drones out to fight the Russians, these FPV drones, it makes it a tiny bit safer to be an infantryman, right? If you know that you're just there in case the Russians push through the final protective lines, and that's when you're going to fight. But the drones will trip the Russians enough so that they run directly into your fire. That makes it a lot easier. So I think drones have had a lot to do with that.
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke to some medics recently as well, foreign medics serving, and they said that yeah, more than 50% of everything is drone related. And I also asked whether there's any difference between the type of injuries they're seeing from artillery compared to drones. And he just kind of shrugged, I mean, all the injuries are horrific, and I think
Yeah.
drones do as much damage as artillery if you get into that proximity of them.
Well, you're getting into multiple traumas. So, and that is a huge problem right now, where any kind of explosive leaves someone with multiple traumas wherever their body armor isn't. So we're talking about wounds to the neck, wounds to the thighs, wounds to the stomach where it's not covered by body armor. And in previous wars, where you only had to worry about rifle fire, yeah, all right, maybe some mortar rounds, maybe some artillery. But take Vietnam for an example. Uh, you could get medevac within an hour, right? There's no more medevac in Ukraine. There's not going to be. I would venture to say that outside of a coin environment, outside of a counterinsurgency environment, we're probably never going to see medevac again. That's gone. That's gone. The bad guys will shoot them down. And
that's the threat to helicopters, right? You physically can't
oh,
get your vehicle or helicopter close enough to.
you won't be able to get ground ambulances close enough either. That's a huge issue. And right now, one of the things that Ukraine is doing is they've actually invented ground drones as medevac drones. So that when there is a lull in artillery, they send the drone up, they load the casualty onto the medevac drone, and the medevac drone will it's a ground drone, and that medevac drone will bring the casualty back to an aid station. So they're even using drones as part of their medevac strategy.
An extraordinary
Yeah.
innovation there. Absolutely terrifying. So, what sort of weapons make a difference? Because we're talking about drones a lot, but it does seem the Ukrainians developing multiple different weapon systems that can be, carried by different types of drones. And then you've still got sort of HIMARS potentially in use and other weapon systems. What's making the play here, or is it actually a combination of different weapon systems that are allowing Ukraine to hold the line? I mean, we look at Pokrovsk and Toretsk, and Russia still isn't really making too much headway there, despite those campaigns going on, grinding for month after month after month.
Yeah. So one of the innovations that Ukraine has developed is there's a drone they call the Backfire K1. And this is essentially a bomber drone. It has an internal bomb bay, and it can hold two mortar rounds or up to 16 VOG-30 grenades as anti-personnel bomblets. And this drone is crewed by an operator, but it has a system on it that can perform the bombing calculations. So if I want to bomb that truck right there, this thing will fly to the operator will fly to the location. The software will calculate when that pilot should release the ordnance. And now you have a drone that can be used multiple times. Instead of just smashing into the target, now you're releasing mortar rounds, which are fairly cheap to manufacture. And that has been one heck of an innovation that they've used, which allows them to reuse their drones again and again. So these bomber drones is something that Russia doesn't have, and certainly something that's been used to great effect inside of Ukraine.
And we are hearing some sort of, again, rumbles about, more air power being provided. We've got
Yeah.
Gripens, we've got the sort of French systems that are sent over, potentially more F-16s from European partners. Is Ukraine going to be able to turn that air war around? Because there are multiple concerns there as well, aren't there? In the current situation with the US, will they have enough sort of air defense systems, or will they have to go back to the choice of, you either defend the front or you defend civilian areas? I mean, the war in the air. What's the state of that?
So I don't know about Gripens. I don't know if those have been sent. I don't believe they have been sent. Maybe they're still talking about that. But I know France sent five Mirage 2000, six Mirage 2000s, I believe, and recently they quietly sent a couple more. And the Mirage 2000 is an air superiority fighter. But it can also carry the Scalp or Storm Shadow cruise missile, the French version of the Storm Shadow cruise missile, which I believe called the Scalp. And that's pretty darn useful because right now their cruise missiles, their air-launched cruise missiles, can only be fired by the Su-24, and they have a limited number of those. I believe 12 or 16. So by getting these Mirage 2000s, I think they call them like Block 5, but not block. There's a French word for it, like Mark 5 or something like that. But by using these, it gives them another flexible option. So they can do air to air, or they can carry one Scalp cruise missile each. And the software is specially modified by France to allow them to do that. So that's pretty darn useful there. Um, the Ideally, the F-16, if it can fire the AMRAAM missile, they could use the F-16 to claw back air superiority. When they claw back air superiority, they can use harm anti-radiation missiles to go after the individual surface-to-air missile radars, which force Russia to move those back. And look, One of the reasons the counteroffensive essentially failed was that Russia was hiding in bunkers and firing at people trying to demine, right? They're firing at these engineers who are trying to clear minefields in order to attack. And Ukraine really had no way of taking out those bunkers. In the US, would just drop a bomb on it. One of the reasons that the war in Ukraine is so static is that you've had this inability to use air power to great effect. During the first war in Iraq, during Operation Desert Storm, we implemented a plan called Airland 2000, Airland Battle 2000. And the whole idea behind Airland 2000 was to perform these massive deep strikes and then have an armor buildup and counterattack. And that's essentially what we did in the Gulf War. That's what we practiced for when we intended to go to war with Russia over the Fulda Gap. Now, the the reason that Russia and Ukraine haven't really been able to make the kind of breakthroughs that are necessary is that neither side can really gain air superiority. And that is a huge problem. And if Ukraine can claw back air superiority with the F-16 and the AMRAAM missile, then they can move forward with using the harm, take out the surface-to-air missiles, which forces people to move back, and then they can drop JDAMs on bunkers that the Russians are in, and that will allow them to counterattack more effectively through minefields.
Is it possible that in a standoff between the US and China, we might see the same um, problem of, not just marine superiority, which we were talking about earlier, but air superiority as well? Or is that going to be likely to be a far more sort of dynamic scenario?
I think that's going to be a pretty dynamic scenario. One of the things that the Air Force has been practicing is this tactic called ACE, Agile Combat Employment. And the whole idea there is that we are clearing off these bases that are in the Pacific, bases we haven't used since World War II. We're clearing them of brush and we're taking these bases and extending the runways, repairing the runways. And the whole idea is that if we have to fight China, the Air Force is going to play musical chairs on these bases. Because if you fire ballistic missiles, right, if you fire ballistic missiles at an airbase, you're not going to get more ballistic missiles, right? The manufacturing time is too long to create a significant amount of ballistic missiles. So what you start the war with is what you're going to finish the war with, right? If you have 1,600 ballistic missiles, maybe you'll have an additional 10 if the war lasts a month. So by constantly moving our planes, it makes it harder for China to decide, oh, I'm going to attack that air base there, right? Because they're not going to blanket all the air bases just in case there's U.S. planes there. So when it comes to the Pacific theater, this whole ACE strategy, it kind of gives us an edge because we know where all the Chinese bases are, and China has an idea of where our bases are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be able to effectively target us. And that's a pretty darn big issue for China. And it kind of gives us that advantage.
If we look at the grand strategy, then tying that in with what we are talking about earlier, which is pivot towards China, counter the increasing threat there, we have just seen a report, and this really needs to be confirmed because it's just Zelensky who's been talking about this at the moment. They apparently have captured two Chinese fighters in Ukraine. So is this possibly, the grand strategy falling apart if China is getting involved on the ground? Or is it far more likely that these are perhaps just sort of, some Chinese students who've been sort of caught up in the draft in Ukraine, in Russia rather, and this isn't something that really we should worry too much about, China really taking part at scale and putting its fighters in there. Because after all, it was also reported that a couple of weeks ago China actually sent monitors on the Ukrainian side to observe some of the techniques being used, which again I find extraordinary that that was allowed to happen. But it also perhaps indicate that China is not directly sending fighters to train and participate on the Russian side.
I don't believe China is sending fighters. I just recently did a video on the order of battle of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, really the People's Liberation Army, which is the ground component of their defense forces. And one of the things that I came upon, this didn't make it into the final cut, but there's a saying in China, you don't use silver to make nails. So even though China is trying to move toward a more professional fighting force, one of their big issues is that people don't necessarily want to join the military. And they do have conscripts, but they're trying to move toward a volunteer force or a well-educated force, a force that has gone to college. And they're also trying to revitalize their NCO corps because they realize how important it is to have good NCOs, good sergeants. And one of the interesting issues with this is that I could easily see someone who was kicked out of the Chinese military who thinks to themselves, you know what? I'm going to go to Russia. I can make X amount of rubles a month. Uh, and I can't get a good job in China unless I want to work at a factory because you don't use silver to make nails, right? I already have the deck stacked against me, so I might as well try my luck with China or with Russia. So I could easily see a situation where Chinese volunteers are volunteering for Russia. I don't necessarily see them actually providing troops. There's just too much downside to that, especially if other countries find out that you have your troops there. But I'm sure Russia will take whatever volunteers it can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many sort of Chinese nationals potentially on Russian soil, farmers and so on,
Hmm.
down in the south. So it's not inconceivable, as well as students in some of the larger cities. Well, we're almost at the end here. And another interesting thing that seems to be sort of gaining some traction. Of course, the Ukrainians were forced to largely leave Kursk, and unfortunately, a lot of equipment was left behind. But they did manage to get most of their people out, at least. They now seem to be pushing into Belgorod. We don't know the extent of that, but it's now been admitted. I mean, I talked to Operator Starsky about this last week, and at that point, he had to say, "I don't know who these people are,"
Yeah.
maybe a little green men kind of scenario. But now it's been admitted that Ukraine is in Belgorod. It's an interesting strategy, isn't it? Because it does seem that Russia, once they've sort of cleared up the sort of and retaken Kursk, those troops could potentially push on in into Sumy and cause some real problems to Ukraine. So it looks like Ukraine is starting to develop this little strategy to sort of poke through into Russia in places just to tie down a bunch of troops and equipment. Do you expect to see these little sort of incursions continuing? Because by all accounts, one estimate, where again it comes from Starsky, Kursk itself has kept up to a quarter rather of Russia's offensive capability actually tied down. When
Yeah.
the alternative is that all those forces will be in the south, causing damage around Toretsk and so on.
No, war is hard, right? And the whole idea is that you need to create dilemmas, not problems for your adversary. And by pushing forces into Russia, no matter where you might conduct one of these assaults, it's embarrassing for Russia. And since they want to defend their own territory, they're going to need to move troops. So that certainly is a possibility that this may be a strategy from Ukraine in order to force Russia to move troops from certain places. I mean, look, the Kursk offensive was so desperate for Russia that they got North Korea involved, right? And that kind of tells you something about Russia's manning, that they felt they needed to bring in North Korea to help with this counterattack, or at least in some cases they use these North Korean soldiers to dig fortifications, but in some they're actually using them for honest to God attacks, right? And if that forced Russia to go to North Korea kind of hat in hand and say, please give us troops, who knows what other kind of pinprick strikes might force Russia to do? Because you want the adversary making decisions based on what you're doing. There's an old quote from General Grant during the American Civil War where he said, I'm tired of hearing, general people. My staff is saying that General Lee is going to do a somersault and land right inside my camp. I'm tired of hearing about what General Lee is going to do. I want him worried about what we're going to do. So the whole point here is tempo. What is your operational tempo? Can you put Russia on the back foot and force them to engage in things they don't want to do, right? They want to keep grinding. But if you're performing these little strikes inside of Russian territory, that kind of throws them off.
Yeah, absolutely. It would seem to be sensible if you can carry on doing that and preventing
Right.
further incursions into your territory. But the last one, this is a bit of a departure
Mhm.
from what we've talked about so far. But you did make a fascinating video about the role of key influencers with impact, people like Tucker Carlson, who are in some cases unconsciously, and in some cases it would seem quite overtly, amplifying Russian narratives. And in some ways, especially Tucker Carlson, this seems to form a sort of fairly toxic information bubble around many people with the administration. From sort of researching that and doing the video, what do you think the extent of this influence of Russian narratives sort of penetrating especially the sort of podcast sphere and those who have some influence within the sort of MAGA world, and how do we counter that? Because some of this stuff is pretty toxic and it certainly doesn't reflect the reality of what Russia's doing, what Russia is, or what Ukraine is.
It's an excellent question. I mean, it's a tough one because here in the US, we have freedom of speech. You're allowed to consume whatever media source you want. So, I don't know. That's a difficult one. The only thing I can give you is to prove those people wrong using facts. And sooner or later, the facts are going to win. And as much as I find a lot of what Tucker Carlson says to be vile, vile gets clicks, right? Vile gets clicks. And I actually kind of believe that Tucker Carlson doesn't necessarily believe everything that he's saying. What he believes is that he wants relevance again. And if being supportive of Russia gives him relevance, well, why not support Russia? I mean, that's where the money's coming from, right?
And
That's where
certainly
the
the dis
views are coming from.
Yeah,
For the
and
but
it taps into
yeah,
a certain distrust, doesn't it? A distrust of Washington, a distrust of traditional politics. There are some people who are now, especially post-COVID, they're drawn to contrarian points of view. Like this
yeah.
guy saying something different. Not that you and I might look at it and go, well, just being different doesn't mean it's factually true. In fact, if it's algorithm driven, it's probably quite the opposite. But there is a real mindset, sort of, be attracted to a contrarian point of view simply because of the sort of, the way mainstream media is viewed, the way sort of mainstream politicians and politics are viewed, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, look, that it gets you clicks, right? If you have that other point of view, right? If you have that point of view that is extreme, you're going to tap into that group of people that are looking for the answers that nobody else has. And I've likened it to Harry Potter, right? You have kids, you read Harry Potter to them, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
why do
absolutely.
kids like Harry Potter? Well, I don't think it's because it's a good story, maybe. I think it's because the average 9-year-old, the average 10-year-old, they don't have any agency, right? They don't even get to decide what they get to put in their mouth, right? That's decided by their mom. So, in order for a kid to fantasize about agency, the idea of fantasizing that they're a wizard and that the adults, the muggles, they don't know the real secrets of the world, right? So modern day, you're a guy, you work all day at a crappy job that you hate, you come home, you watch TV, you go to bed, all to get up again the next day and do it again, right? When something comes into your feed that says, hey, the reason your taxes are so high is that we've sent $200 billion to Ukraine and Zelensky bought a boat. Well, that's a really powerful fantasy, right? This is why it's just like Harry Potter. This is why I'm in this situation. I can imagine myself that I know the true secret that's behind the curtain, right? I think that's kind of why that narrative is so popular. It's no different than Harry Potter. It's Harry Potter for adults. A lot of the conspiracy theories about Russia, right? It's essentially a way for someone to blame their problems on something else.
That's it. And we're talking about complex stuff. The reality we're talking about is complex and nuanced. It requires a lot of effort and thinking, and we don't necessarily give people the answers because maybe there aren't simple answers. But yeah, I can see why the fantasy version of reality is dangerously attractive.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for coming back on. I've mentioned, referenced quite a few of your episodes there. I strongly recommend to the audience they check those out. There's lots of amazing stuff in there. And for anyone who isn't familiar, I'm sure most people are with your output. Yeah, it comes highly recommended and it's very useful. Another layer of information and insight that can help people to, understand what's going on, but also potentially support Ukraine as well. So thank you so much for coming back on.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pleasure.